They never meant for you to hear this. Not in Charleston, not in South Carolina, not anywhere in America. For nearly 2 centuries, a single story was sealed away under vaults of silence and rivers of blood money. A story whispered only in private diaries and burned letters. A story that, once revealed, destroys the illusion of honor, tradition, and Southern nobility. On a fog-drenched October morning in 1823, the people of Charleston awoke to an absence. 7 enslaved souls had vanished from the Ravencraft plantation. Shackles lay broken in the dirt, and in the center of the room, on a table slick with dried blood, sat a single document marked with the seal of Colonel Thaddius Ravencraft. That document, when opened, revealed a pact so obscene, so strategically cruel, it would unravel one of the wealthiest dynasties in the South. But before we turn its pages, you must understand this. This is not a story of romance, nor is it merely another tale of slavery's brutality. This is a story of a contract, a wedding gift, that turned human beings into instruments of psychological experimentation, designed not for profit alone, but for domination of the human soul itself. And here's where the darkness deepens. The colonel's bride, Cordelia, was no passive recipient of her husband's wealth. She was the architect of this nightmare. Her gift request was not a necklace, not a carriage, not a jewel-studded trinket. She asked for 7 human beings, flesh, blood, spirit, to be signed over to her in secret. Not as household help, not as field laborers, but as living test subjects in her blueprint for what she called a new science of obedience. She wanted to see what happened when you broke love, destroyed trust, rewired loyalty, and reconstructed human will. And the colonel, towering, decorated, intoxicated by her ambition, agreed. What followed was hidden, buried, suppressed for narrations. And yet, fragments of the truth have survived. In letters stained with ink and sweat. In court transcripts never meant for daylight. In rumors passed between families who knew they were living next door to something monstrous. Tonight, we open that vault. Tonight, you will hear the truth about the secret deal that destroyed a dynasty, and the 7 chosen slaves who became unwilling participants in an experiment that foreshadowed the psychological control systems still used in quieter, more polished ways today. This is not history. This is a warning. Charleston County, 1822. Cotton fields rolled like endless seas of green beneath the southern sun, each stalk carrying not just wealth, but the weight of lives bound in chains. This was the world that Colonel Thaddius Ravencraft commanded. To his peers, he was the perfect embodiment of Southern nobility. 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, eyes like polished steel, beard trimmed with military precision. His war service during 1812 had earned him medals, government land grants, and the kind of reputation that silences a room when he entered it. He was, by all outward accounts, a man destined to carve his family name into the very granite of history. But behind his polished boots and grand speeches lay a mind obsessed with calculation. Thaddius kept ledgers not just of his cotton yields, but of every human being he owned. Each entry coldly itemized: name, age, skills, family ties, physical strength, and most disturbingly, an updated market value, revised monthly, as if these were cattle to be traded on a fluctuating exchange. He knew which enslaved men carried iron like kings of the forge. He knew which women could coax healing from roots and herbs. He knew which children were strong enough to carry the future, and which were destined to break before reaching adulthood. This obsessive attention to detail won him admiration among other plantation owners. They called it efficiency. But in truth, it was a form of possession that blurred the line between stewardship and sadism. And it was this very mindset that made him the perfect counterpart for Cordelia Peaton, the young bride who would whisper into his ear an idea so grotesque it eclipsed even his cold mathematics. Cordelia was not like other women of her station. Born into wealth, raised among the cruel arithmetic of her father's slave markets, she saw humans not as people, not even as mere property, but as raw material to be shaped, tested, broken, and rebuilt. During her courtship with Thaddius, she asked no questions about flowers, no idle chatter about dresses. Instead, she probed the numbers. She wanted to know crop yields, ratios of cost to profit, and methods of control. She was building something in her mind, a vision of a plantation not just of bodies, but of obedience itself. And so, when the wedding approached, her request was as calm as it was horrifying. 7 souls, bound and delivered to her complete command. 7 lives, not to work the fields, but to be transformed into instruments of absolute submission. What the colonel agreed to that night was not merely a wedding gift. It was the opening of a door. And once opened, darkness began to pour through. October 15th, 1822. The morning sun poured gold across the Ravencraft estate, and to the casual eye, it was a vision of paradise. White ribbons swayed from towering oaks, imported musicians tuned their instruments in the garden pavilion, and hundreds of guests arrived in polished carriages, their wheels grinding the red clay roads into powder. The union of Colonel Thaddius Ravencraft and Cordelia Piton was not merely a marriage. It was a performance staged for the most powerful families of the South. Senators, governors, and judges mingled with the plantation elite, their laughter carrying over tables stacked high with delicacies and French champagne. To the world, this was a celebration of tradition, honor, and wealth. But beneath the music, beneath the glitter, beneath the clinking of crystal glasses, a darker melody was already playing. For 3 days, the estate roared with feasts, dances, and endless toasts. Thaddius himself strode through the crowd in his gleaming military dress, medals catching the candlelight, while Cordelia, radiant in imported silk, embodied the flawless image of Southern grace. To the guests, they seemed like a perfect pair, the disciplined war hero and the refined heiress, joining bloodlines to cement a dynasty that would endure for generations. What no one in those glittering halls suspected was that this dynasty was already poisoned at its root. The pivotal moment came during the gift presentation, a ritual where the groom publicly declared the wedding gift bestowed upon his bride. Guests leaned forward, expecting jewels, silver, or perhaps a grand carriage. Thaddius lifted his voice, commanding the pavilion's silence. His words, at first, seemed bold but respectable. He praised Cordelia's intelligence, her business acumen, her rare dedication to the prosperity of their household. But then, with a casual cruelty that sent chills down the spine of the few who truly listened, he revealed his gift. 7 enslaved souls, chosen not for beauty or refinement, but for their skills, their strength, and their potential for what he called innovative management. The crowd gasped, some in shock, others in fascination. Many clapped politely, whispering about the progressive nature of such an arrangement. A handful of planters even approached the colonel that night, eager to learn more about these methods his wife intended to test. But not all were fooled. A local doctor, Edmund Fitzgerald, felt his stomach turn at the sterile language used to describe human lives. Reverend Hartwell, seated near the back, bowed his head in silence, whispering prayers he suspected no one wanted to hear. And yet, as the music swelled and champagne flowed, the guests chose comfort over conscience. They celebrated, they danced, they laughed beneath chandeliers, never realizing that at that very moment, beyond the reach of music and firelight, 7 human beings were being torn from their families, marched into a hidden building deep in the woods, and sealed into a nightmare they could not escape. While silk gowns swept across marble floors and violins sang into the night, another procession was unfolding in silence, away from the eyes of the guests. Along a narrow path through the pine woods, lit only by lanterns shielded from view, 7 enslaved souls were marched under guard toward a structure that had been carefully prepared for months in advance. To anyone passing by, It looked like nothing more than an old textile workshop, a modest barn with smoke-stained beams and shuttered windows. But Cordelia knew better. She had designed it herself, down to the last iron hinge, the last bolt in the floor. This was not a workshop. It was a theater of control. Inside, the air smelled of pine tar and damp earth. Reinforced walls closed in tight, their thickness chosen not for insulation, but for silence. Barred windows sat high, too high to glimpse the fields or sky. Partitioned rooms stood ready to swallow each individual into isolation, stripping away the bonds of family, community, and comfort. And at the center of it all lay the chamber Cordelia named the instruction room. Here, the tools were not plows or looms, but devices of restraint, whips of varied thickness, and more unsettling still, implements designed to inflict not only pain, but confusion, disorientation, and despair. The 7 who entered that night were not strangers plucked at random. They were a family, 3 generations bound not just by blood, but by years of survival under the Colonel's empire. Joshua, the blacksmith, whose hands had forged chains that bound others even as he longed for freedom. His wife, Rebecca, a seamstress whose quiet skill had clothed both masters and the enslaved. Their children, Samuel, Mary, and David, each marked by their own resilience. And Mary's 2 little ones, eyes wide, clutching her skirts, too young to understand why laughter from the big house had turned into silence. In the woods, Cordelia's experiment required them precisely because of what they shared: love, loyalty, and unbroken unity. To her, this was weakness, an obstacle to the perfect worker. To her, family ties were inefficiency, distraction, defiance waiting to bloom. Her mission was to break it, piece by piece, bond by bond, until nothing remained but obedience sculpted into flesh. That night, as the revelry thundered in the distance, Cordelia stood in her hidden chamber, pen in hand, recording observations before the first command was ever given. She did not hear violins. She did not hear laughter. She heard only the future, the birth of her new science of obedience, and the cries of 7 souls who would soon learn what it meant to be remade in her image. The first stage of Cordelia's design was not violence. It was silence. She understood what many masters ignored, that the greatest strength of the enslaved was not in their backs or their hands, but in their ties to one another. Family, love, loyalty. These were invisible chains stronger than any iron forged by Joshua's hammer. To control the body was easy. To control the soul, one had to sever its connections. So, the family was divided. Joshua was placed in a narrow chamber with walls so close his broad shoulders brushed against the timber when he turned. Rebecca was sent to another room, her needle and thread stripped from her hands, leaving her fingers restless and useless. Samuel, Mary, and David were each sealed into their own quarters, while Mary's children were taken to a locked cell together, their cries echoing down the corridor like wounds no whip could inflict. Meals were delivered at staggered times, never together, never shared. Work periods were supervised in silence, conversation punished with lashes, or worse. At night, when the music of the wedding celebration carried faintly across the fields, the Kane family lay awake in darkness, each alone, each wondering whether the others still breathed. Days bled into weeks, and soon into months. And as time stretched thin, Cordelia introduced her next weapon: lies. She would enter Joshua's chamber, her voice smooth, her eyes unwavering, and whisper that his son Samuel had called him weak, unfit for the forge. Then she would visit Samuel and say his father had asked for him to be punished, for laziness, for disrespect. She told Mary that Rebecca resented her, that her mother wished her burdened with more suffering. Every word was carefully chosen, every seed of mistrust watered with silence and enforced distance, and when suspicion began to bloom, Cordelia added another cruelty, what she called cross-punishment. If Samuel resisted an order, Rebecca would be whipped. If Mary cried out, her children would be beaten. If Joshua hesitated, David would be forced to suffer in his place. It was not just about pain. It was about breaking the natural reflex to protect one another. The bonds of loyalty twisted into chains of guilt, each act of defiance turning into a weapon against those they loved. Cordelia recorded everything. She noted the changes in their eyes, the shifts in posture, the way silence grew heavier each day until even when they stood near one another, they no longer met each other's gaze. To her, this was progress. To them, it was the slow murder of everything that had kept them alive. And yet, even as the family began to fracture, a fire smoldered beneath the ashes, a spark Cordelia did not yet see. If isolation cracked the bonds of trust, Cordelia believed competition would shatter them. She called it productivity bonding, though the phrase itself was nothing more than a mask, polite language wrapped around cruelty. The system was simple, brutal, and devastating. Each family member's survival now depended not only on their own performance, but on the failures of those they loved. Tasks were assigned with cold precision. Joshua, the blacksmith, was ordered to forge tools under strict time limits. Samuel and David were pushed into grueling field labor, expected to harvest more cotton than any man could reasonably manage. Mary was tested in domestic work and forced to gather herbs for remedies under impossible deadlines. Even Rebecca, aging and weary, was commanded to sew garments with stitch counts that left her fingers raw and bleeding. And the children, their small bodies trembling under the weight of buckets too heavy for them, were ordered to carry water, to sweep endlessly, to move stones from one side of the compound to the other, back and forth, hour after hour. At the end of each day, results were compared. Whoever excelled received slightly better treatment, an extra portion of food, a softer blanket, a night without punishment. Whoever fell short was punished, but not alone. Their failure triggered pain for another. If Samuel faltered in the fields, Rebecca would be whipped. If Joshua's ironwork broke, Mary's children would go hungry. If the children stumbled with their buckets, their mother would be lashed until her screams echoed through the timber walls. Cordelia observed this with satisfaction. She wanted their love to become their torment. She wanted their loyalty to turn into guilt, their instinct to protect one another to become the very thing that destroyed them. In her mind, this was efficiency perfected, a system where the enslaved policed themselves, where the whip was no longer in the master's hand, but in the trembling heart of the slave. The results came quickly. Joshua's proud shoulders stooped lower each week. Rebecca's eyes dulled, her voice fading into whispers. Samuel clenched his fists, not against the guards, but against his own reflection in the iron he forged. Mary's tears carved silent lines down her face as her children cried themselves to sleep, too young to understand why their pain came from the failures of those who loved them most. Cordelia wrote in her journals that the method produced remarkable compliance in record time. To her, the Cain family was no longer a family at all. They were fragments, broken pieces, reassembled into something she believed she could control forever. But she mistook silence for surrender. In the cracks of her experiment, something dangerous was forming. Not hatred for one another, but hatred for her. And in that hatred, the possibility of rebellion began to take root. Cordelia believed her system was flawless. She thought she had cut the threads of love, drowned loyalty beneath guilt, and forced the family to betray one another simply to survive. But cruelty, no matter how carefully engineered, always creates its own cracks. For every whip she raised, for every lie she planted, the Cain family carved out small, secret acts of defiance that slipped beneath her watchful gaze. It began with silence. Not the silence Cordelia imposed, but a deeper one. An unspoken language shared between those who had endured too much together to be broken apart by lies. When Joshua was told that Samuel had mocked him, he did not believe. He had raised that boy with his own hands, taught him to hammer iron, to temper steel. He knew the cadence of his son's spirit, and no words from Cordelia's lips could poison it completely. He held his silence, but in his heart, he refused to yield. Rebecca, frail and worn though she was, found her strength in the smallest gestures. When food was rationed unevenly, she would tuck half her portion beneath her skirt, finding ways to slip it to her grandchildren without the guards noticing. Sometimes it was only a crust of bread, a few scraps of meat, but in the cold mathematics of Cordelia's experiment, such scraps were rebellion. Proof that love could still move unseen. Samuel, Mary, and David carried their resistance in their eyes. Though they were forbidden to speak, when their paths crossed in the compound, a glance, brief but burning, was enough to remind them that Cordelia had not severed everything. In the dark, after days of forced labor, they began to communicate in whispers too faint for guards to catch. A tap on a wall, a shift in footsteps. Small, desperate signals that carried meaning no whip could erase. Even the children, though too young to understand strategy, became symbols of endurance. Their very laughter and are rare and fragile, carried more power than Cordelia's punishments. For when Mary heard her son giggle despite hunger, she knew that spirit had not been extinguished. Cordelia, in her arrogance, mistook these quiet acts for compliance. Her journals grew thick with notes praising the obedience of her test subjects, oblivious to the fact that every entry was a lie she was writing to herself. The Kane family was not broken. They were waiting. And as the winter of 1822 tightened its grip, that waiting began to turn into something sharper. Whispers became plans. Pain became fuel. Obedience became a mask. Beneath it, the fire of rebellion glowed hotter with each passing night. While the Kane family endured their silent war in the shadows of the workshop, the colonel presented a different story to the world. To his peers, he spoke not of screams echoing through pine woods, not of broken families and secret punishments, but of efficiency, innovation, and progress. Over brandy in Charleston parlors and during hunts with fellow planters, Thaddius dropped fragments of Cordelia's ideas, shaping them into something that sounded less like cruelty and more like a bold frontier of management. The whispers spread quickly. Plantation society thrived on novelty cloaked as refinement. Men who measured their worth in cotton bales and the number of enslaved bodies they commanded listened closely when Thaddius spoke of Cordelia's science of obedience. They leaned forward when he described how loyalty itself could be reprogrammed, how family bonds, so often a source of resistance, could be inverted into mechanisms of control. Some scoffed, calling it womanly meddling, but others were intrigued. The thought of wives taking on a more direct role in plantation discipline gave the illusion of progress while preserving power. Behind closed doors, correspondence began to stir. Letters moved from Charleston to Savannah, from Richmond to New Orleans, speaking cautiously of the Piton method. Those who heard rumors wanted details. How did it work? Could it be replicated? Could it become the future of Southern wealth? An empire not just of bodies, but of minds molded to compliance. Thaddius basked in the attention. He was a soldier who had turned himself into a strategist, a master who saw in Cordelia's cruelty a reflection of his own ruthless ambition. To him, the Kane family was not suffering. They were proof of concept. And though he never spoke the whole truth, he allowed enough to circulate that others began to view the Ravencraft plantation as a kind of laboratory for control, but not all ears received his words with admiration. Dr. Edmund Fitzgerald, the physician who had long tended to enslaved laborers with what little mercy the system allowed, grew uneasy. He had seen broken bodies, starved children, the scars of whips. But the language Thaddius used was different. It was clinical, detached, stripped of even the pretense of humanity. The doctor wrote in his own journal that the colonel's speech reeked not merely of cruelty, but of design, a cruelty multiplied through method, made into something more dangerous than violence itself. And beneath the glittering facades of plantation balls, beneath the cigars and laughter, Reverend Samuel Hartwell also heard the whispers. He recognized something older than the South, older than slavery itself. He heard the echo of Rome's circuses, Babylon's idols, Egypt's chains, civilizations that rose on domination and fell when their cruelty became too refined, too calculated, too complete. For now, though, the whispers worked in the colonel's favor. Neighbors raised their glasses to his progress. Letters arrived asking for demonstrations. A few even offered to send their own enslaved families to be tested in Cordelia's hands. The Ravencraft dynasty looked poised to ascend higher than ever. But in the workshop, the Kane family's eyes burned in the dark, and their hatred was no longer a seed. It was beginning to grow into a plan. Winter nights on the plantation stretched long and bitter, the kind of cold that seeps into bone and makes breath visible in the darkness. For most, the season meant huddling closer to fire and family. But for the Kane family, scattered across their cells, winter became a crucible. In the stillness of the frozen fields, when guards dozed and the air turned sharp, the family began to carve out their rebellion. It started with Samuel. He had always been restless, too sharp-eyed to collapse entirely under Cordelia's system. Watching the guards, he noticed their routines, the way one favored a flask too much after nightfall, the way another lingered by the fire rather than patrolling the outer yard. He tapped these rhythms onto the wall of his chamber at night, faint enough that only David in the next cell could hear. David, younger but quick to learn, passed the message along in murmured coughs when the overseer walked by. Soon, the whole family knew the guards' patterns. Knowledge became their weapon. Rebecca, though weakened, played her role as well. She feigned brokenness so convincingly that the overseers all but ignored her. Yet behind her sunken eyes and trembling hands, she smuggled scraps of thread and cloth, stolen during her sewing punishments. In the dim light of her cell, she wove them into cords, fragile-looking, but strong enough when braided together. They were not tools of labor. They were tools of escape. Joshua, once the proud blacksmith, now beaten down, found his spirit rekindled through his children's secret signs. He remembered the feel of iron, the weight of hammer and anvil. In his mind, he forged weapons from nothing. His hands, though bare, remained calloused with memory. When the time came, he knew he could turn even the simplest tool into something sharp enough to cut freedom from chains. Even the children carried their part. Too small to plan, too innocent to be strategic. They did the one thing Cordelia never calculated. They endured. Their laughter, their whispered games in the dark, reminded the others what they were fighting for. Hope, fragile and flickering, was kept alive in their smiles. The family never spoke the word aloud. They never dared. But in every glance, in every gesture, in every risk they took to share food or signal across walls, the meaning was clear. They were preparing for something greater than survival. Cordelia, meanwhile, scribbled in her journal about her successes. She noted how compliant the family had become, how silence had replaced resistance, how their eyes no longer met. She congratulated herself for perfecting her system, blind to the truth that her subjects were no longer merely surviving her cruelty. They were hiding beneath it, sharpening themselves against it. And when spring crept back over Charleston County, thawing the fields and loosening the frozen soil, the Kane family's plan was ready to take its first breath. The first act of defiance came not with shouts or fire, but with something small, almost invisible. Cordelia had ordered a new round of cross punishments that spring, determined to tighten her hold. Mary was commanded to complete a bundle of weaving within an impossible deadline. When she failed, as Cordelia had intended, the lash was turned not upon her, but upon her son, barely 6 years old. The boy was dragged to the instruction room, his arms too thin to resist. But as the overseer raised the whip, something broke in the silence. It was not the boy who cried first. It was Joshua. His booming voice, hoarse from months of silence, thundered through the chamber walls. No more. The word was raw, jagged, torn from his chest like iron ripped from a forge. It rattled through the compound, bouncing against timber and stone, filling every crack of the workshop. The overseer hesitated, startled by the sudden eruption. And in that heartbeat of hesitation, Samuel made his move. From beneath his cot, Samuel pulled the cord Rebecca had woven. With one swift motion, he looped it around the overseer's arm, yanking it back. The whip fell to the floor, and the child scrambled free, rushing into Mary's arms. David lunged next, his fists striking not with skill, but with desperate fury. Each blow fueled by months of swallowed rage. The overseer staggered, shouting for help, but the sound was drowned out by the clamor inside the workshop. Joshua slammed his body against his chamber door again and again until the wood groaned under the strain. Rebecca, frail though she seemed, hurled her body against the walls, creating a pounding rhythm that echoed like a war drum, feeding the others' courage. Even the children joined, stomping their small feet in defiance, their cries no longer of fear, but of fury. By the time the second guard arrived, chaos had replaced silence. What had once been Cordelia's carefully ordered experiment now pulsed with rebellion. The overseers fought to restore control, dragging Samuel down, striking David across the face, ripping the child from Mary's arms. Blood stained the floor, screams filled the air, but something irreversible had happened. The Kane family had broken the first rule of Cordelia's system. They no longer wore the mask of obedience. That night, Cordelia wrote furiously in her journal. Her elegant handwriting jagged with rage. She called it an anomaly, a breakdown in discipline, the result of momentary weakness in enforcement. She ordered harsher punishments, stricter routines, and vowed to crush what she saw as cracks in her design. But she had missed the truth. This was no crack. It was the first fracture in the foundation of her empire. And once stone begins to split, even the strongest walls cannot stand forever. Cordelia could not allow the Kane family's rebellion to stand. In her mind, defiance was a disease, and diseases must be cut out before they spread. That very night, she devised a new set of methods, more vicious, more surgical, designed not only to punish, but to unmake the will itself. She called it her refinement phase. The next morning, she summoned the family into the instruction room. No overseer spoke. The silence was deliberate, a calculated void that pressed against the senses. She paced before them like a conductor before an orchestra, her face serene, her voice smooth as she announced the beginning of a correction. Samuel was dragged forward first. His wrists were bound in iron restraints. Cordelia looked into his eyes, and with that sickening calmness she was known for, she whispered, "Strength must be broken before it can be rebuilt. You mistook courage for rebellion. Now, I will show you the difference." The punishments were no longer simple lashes or deprivation. They became theater. One family member was forced to watch while another suffered, unable to intervene. Mary was made to stand as her brother Samuel was beaten. Joshua was chained, gagged, and forced to watch while Rebecca's hands were burned with heated irons, destroying the very fingers that had stitched and mended for decades. The children, too young to understand, too young to fight, were used as props in Cordelia's new psychological architecture. She would tell them, "Your mother suffers because you failed to obey." Then she would turn to Mary and say, "See how their fear makes them obey me? Not you." This was not random cruelty. It was design. Cordelia believed that if love could be weaponized into guilt, and guilt redirected into obedience, she could create a new breed of worker. One who no longer recognized bonds of family, but only bonds of command. Yet, as brutal as her refinements became, something stirred beneath the surface. Pain did not erase memory. Punishment did not kill hope. Rebecca, her hands blistered and raw, still found ways to whisper forbidden words of comfort to her children in the darkness. Joshua, even gagged, communicated through looks, through the stomp of his boot, through the steady rhythm of defiance pulsing beneath every blow he endured. Cordelia could break bodies. She could twist minds. But there was something she had not accounted for. The human will to endure not for oneself, but for the survival of blood, of name, of lineage. And in trying to sever that bond, she had only driven it deeper underground, where roots grow strongest. Outside, the plantation continued its rhythm of harvests and social visits. Guests who came to dine with the colonel praised Cordelia's efficiency, marveling at her discipline. None of them knew that behind the oak forest, a new kind of war was brewing. A silent, brutal war between one woman's obsession with power and one family's refusal to die as tools. And though Cordelia tightened the chains, the Kane family had begun to see something she could not hide forever. Even the most perfect cage has a door, if one learns where the cracks lie. Colonel Thaddius Ravencraft was a man accustomed to order. In battle, in business, in society, his authority had always been absolute. Yet by the spring of 1823, a strange dissonance had begun to seep into his household. At first, it was nothing more than rumors carried in hushed tones by servants, strange cries echoing through the pines at night, overseers walking with bruised faces and bandaged hands, whispers of the workshop that no one dared describe. The colonel dismissed these murmurs at first. He told himself it was idle talk, the sort of plantation gossip that festers when discipline is strong. Yet, when he rode past the forest path one evening, he swore he heard something beneath the chirp of cicadas, a low, rhythmic pounding, like a heartbeat against wood. It unsettled him more than cannon fire ever had. When he confronted Cordelia, she met him with the same poised calm that had once enchanted him. She poured his brandy, placed a hand upon his arm, and smiled as she spoke. Innovation always sounds violent at first, but in time, you will see its brilliance. The colonel wanted to believe her. Cotton yields had indeed risen, productivity measured in ledgers and tallies. Neighbors praised his foresight in marrying such a capable woman. And yet, something in her eyes had changed. There was a gleam there, not of partnership, but of ownership. As though she were no longer his wife but the mistress of something larger, darker, something that even he was excluded from. Then came the report from Marcus Bellwether, his discreet attorney. One of the guards, drunk in Charleston taverns, had let slip fragments of what went on in the hidden barn. Bellwether, alarmed, hinted at experimental cruelties that went far beyond customary plantation discipline. He urged the colonel to tighten control, lest word reach rivals who would use such scandal to dismantle his standing. For the first time, Thaddius felt the chill of vulnerability. His name, his dynasty, was being bound to his wife's secret games. If exposure came, he would not be seen as a visionary, but as a monster. Yet when he tried to rein Cordelia in, she stood before him in her silk gown, her lips a thin line, and said words that struck him deeper than any musket ball. You think this is your empire, Thaddius, but without me, it all falls. It was then the colonel understood. What he had thought was a partnership was now a contest. His wife had become more than a companion. She had become a rival, an architect of power whose dominion was built not in the fields, but in the human mind. And in that realization, a seed of dread took root. For the colonel began to see that he was no longer the master of his house. He had invited something into his dynasty that could not be controlled, and in the shadows of the workshop, it was already feeding on his legacy. Cordelia had discovered something intoxicating. Control was no longer confined to the 7 souls in her workshop. It was a force she could extend outward, weaving invisible strings around everyone within reach. The Kane family had been her crucible, her laboratory. Now she tested her methods on those who thought themselves free. She began with the overseers. Hardened men, loyal only to coin, were accustomed to barking orders and swinging whips with impunity. Yet Cordelia dismantled their swagger with terrifying ease. She praised one in public, then humiliated him in private, seeding doubt between his worth and his pride. She made 2 men compete for her approval, rewarding one with fine cigars while denying the other even the dignity of acknowledgement. Soon they were no longer enforcers, but supplicants, desperate for her favor, their loyalty shifting from the colonel's gold to Cordelia's shadowed approval. Then, she turned her gaze higher. Thaddius himself. She knew his weaknesses, his hunger for legacy, his fear of scandal, his pride in his image as master and strategist. She began to speak to him not as wife to husband, but as visionary to financier. At dinners, she draped herself across his arm and whispered promises of empire. What we are building will not just rule these fields. It will rule the South itself. But in the quiet hours, her tone changed. She would let silences stretch until his confidence cracked, then drop words like venom. Do you command this house, Thaddius? Or do you only pretend? She showed him fragments of her journals, pages filled with clinical diagrams of obedience and control, evidence of a mind that functioned less like a planter's wife and more like a general of the psyche. The colonel, for all his battlefield experience, found himself cornered. He could not openly oppose her without risking the unraveling of their alliance, nor could he fully submit without forfeiting his authority. So he did what men of his standing so often did. He remained silent, convincing himself that silence was strategy, but silence was what Cordelia craved. With every unspoken protest, with every look of doubt swallowed back into his chest, she grew bolder. Soon, it was not Thaddius who commanded the plantation's rhythm, but Cordelia. The schedules, the punishments, even the distribution of food and clothing, all funneled through her. Visitors began to comment, half jesting, that the Ravencraft estate was the ladies' plantation. Behind the veneer of Southern grace, Cordelia's web stretched wider, binding not just slaves but soldiers, not just children but men, not just overseers, but the colonel himself. She was no longer experimenting on the Kane family alone. She was testing how far power could reach before anyone dared to resist. And though her reign appeared seamless, though her methods seemed unbreakable, something dangerous stirred beneath the surface. For in the Kane family's whispers, and in the colonel's uneasy silence, resistance was beginning to take a new shape, one that Cordelia had not calculated for. The Kane family had endured months of cruelty, yet from within their torment, a strange alchemy began to occur. Pain no longer shattered them, it sharpened them. What Cordelia mistook for submission was, in truth, the forging of resolve. Beneath the chains, in the silence between punishments, they began to weave a language of resistance. It started with glances. A raised eyebrow from Joshua meant patience. A slight shake of the head from Rebecca meant danger. The children learned quickly, their small eyes darting, memorizing the secret code passed between their elders. When overseers dragged them to work under Cordelia's supervision, Samuel would stomp his foot in rhythm, once for watch, twice for wait. David would respond with a cough, signaling he understood. Mary, clutching her children close, began to hum low melodies at night, the lullabies carrying hidden warnings threaded into their tune. Cordelia believed she had broken their unity, but she had only forced it deeper underground, like roots pushing beneath stone. In silence, the family found new ways to remain bound together. And slowly, their unity began to turn into planning. Joshua, once a blacksmith, studied every shackle, every iron hinge, every bolt in the workshop walls. He ran his hands along the iron under the guise of obedience, but his mind catalogued every weakness. Rebecca, though her fingers were scarred, learned which guards fell asleep at their posts, which keys jingled too loosely on their belts. Samuel and David tested the overseers' tempers, feigning submission to learn exactly how much force they would use and when. Even the children played their part, pretending fear while stealing scraps of food and tucking them away in secret corners. Their plan was not yet a plan. It was a gathering of fragments, a collection of secrets hidden in the marrow of each day. But the seed was planted. Escape as possible. Not today. Perhaps not tomorrow. But soon, what fueled them was not simply survival. It was the fire Cordelia herself had ignited. By turning their love into a weapon, she had made that love indestructible. Every time she forced them to betray one another, they vowed silently to restore their bond. Every time she punished one for the other's weakness, they promised that one day, she would feel the weight of their unity in full. Cordelia wrote in her journal that the Kane family was near collapse. But in truth, they had never been stronger. For the greatest weapon against tyranny is not rebellion shouted from rooftops. It is rebellion whispered in the dark, carried quietly until the right moment to strike. And in the stillness of the night, as the pine trees swayed and the distant mansion glowed with music and laughter, the Kane family whispered to themselves a single promise. We will not die in chains. By midsummer, the Kane family's defiance had begun to leave faint traces, subtle, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't searching. A nail loosened here, a lock that clicked strangely after being secured. Overseers who swore they heard whispers in the dark when no one was supposed to be speaking. These were not accidents. They were tests, probes against the edges of Cordelia's system, quiet rehearsals for something larger. The overseers reported their suspicions to the colonel. They spoke of disobedience, of strange rhythms tapped on the walls, of glances exchanged that seemed to carry meaning. The colonel, though outwardly dismissive, felt the unease grow. He remembered the battlefield, how rebellion never began with banners, but with whispers, murmurs, signals passed between soldiers before the first musket fired. The Kane family, he suspected, had not been broken. They were gathering themselves, like storm clouds gathering heat before the thunder. When he confronted Cordelia again, she dismissed his concerns with icy precision. They are tools, she said, her voice sharp as a blade. And tools cannot rebel. They can only be sharpened, or they can be broken. What you hear are not signals, but the echoes of weakness being refined into strength. Trust me, Thaddius. I am not losing control. I am creating control. The colonel wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe his wife's confidence, the measured poise in her voice. But the unease gnawed at him. At night, he dreamed of the Kane family's eyes that had watched him for years, first with fear, then with something else he could not name. It was not hatred. It was not even rebellion. It was something colder, something patient. Meanwhile, inside the workshop, the Kane family understood that the walls themselves were listening. So they sharpened their silence into a blade. They no longer wept under punishment. They no longer begged. Their silence became heavier, more defiant, until even Cordelia noticed it. She called it the stillness before obedience. But in truth, it was the stillness before eruption. Rebecca, whispering into her daughter's ear, put it best. Chains can break, locks can open, but the hardest thing for them to kill is patience. The colonel, watching his wife glide across drawing rooms in her silk gowns, could not shake the sense that somewhere behind the pine trees, a game was being played that even he was not part of. And though he did not yet know it, the Kane family's patience was about to outlast Cordelia's calculations. It began with fire. Not the roaring blaze of a rebellion, but a quiet, calculated ember, placed where it would wound without destroying. One of the looms in the workshop, a machine Cordelia prized for her experimental textile labor, was found smoldering in the night. The damage was contained quickly, but the message was unmistakable. Obedience was not absolute. Cordelia examined the charred wood with trembling fingers, her face a mask of icy calm. Yet beneath the surface fury boiled. She had calculated every variable, measured every breath the Kane family took, recorded every gesture. And still, they had found a way to strike. It was not the fire itself that unnerved her. It was the choice. They had not tried to escape. They had not attacked the guards. They had chosen a symbol. They had chosen to show her they still possessed the one weapon she could not account for. Will. The overseers demanded harsher punishment. The colonel, drawn to the scene, stood in silence as Cordelia ordered new restraints, tighter surveillance, and the confiscation of every object not nailed to the floor. But even he saw it, the faint glimmer in Joshua's eyes as the old blacksmith was dragged past him. That glimmer was not fear. It was challenge. Cordelia gathered the family in the instruction room and announced the beginning of what she called total erasure. From now on, there would be no distinction between work and punishment, no division between day and night. Sleep would be fractured, food rationed, speech forbidden under threat of immediate retribution. The children were separated from their mother, placed in opposite corners of the compound, their cries muffled by stone walls. Samuel and David were forced to labor side by side in silence, each punished for the slightest hesitation of the other. Rebecca was confined in isolation for days at a time, her scarred hands bound so tightly that circulation faltered. Yet, the more Cordelia pressed, the more something strange began to happen. The family no longer broke beneath her refinements. They adapted. They used her punishments as signals, learning to anticipate patterns, to communicate even through silence. A withheld ration meant wait. A shared punishment meant prepare. The Kane family's unity became invisible, but not destroyed. It was mutating into something sharper, harder to kill. The colonel watched the process with a soldier's unease. He had seen it before, in enemy lines during the war, the point where suppression no longer weakens the opponent, but steals them. Cordelia called it progress. He recognized it for what it was, the sharpening edge of revolt. And though Cordelia still believed herself untouchable, that smoldering loom had already written the truth in smoke. Her empire was burning from the inside, and the flames were spreading. Cordelia could not sleep. Each night she replayed the image of that smoldering loom in her mind, its blackened wood mocking her, its ashes whispering of failure. The Kane family haunted her, not as broken tools, but as opponents, enemies who dared to resist her will. In her journals, once precise and clinical, her handwriting grew jagged. She no longer wrote of efficiency or experiments. She wrote of conquest, of annihilation. If they would not break, she would erase. She began what she called the fracture trials. At dawn, family members were dragged into the instruction room, not for punishment, but for theater. One was forced to kneel as the others watched. Cordelia would stand before them, dressed in her finest gown, her voice calm as she asked a single question. Who will betray first? She promised rewards, extra food, an end to isolation, for the one who exposed disobedience. But when silence met her question, her rewards twisted into punishments. Mary was forced to watch her child deprived of water until he collapsed. Joshua was forced to choose which of his sons would be beaten that day. Rebecca was told that her silence condemned her grandchildren. The cruelty was not in the lash, but in the choice. Cordelia believed this would hollow them from the inside, pit their love against their survival until nothing remained but obedience. But she miscalculated. The Kane family refused her theater. They accepted the punishments, the hunger, the torment. They gave her nothing, and in that nothing, they revealed her weakness. For the first time, Cordelia's power did not terrify. It exposed her desperation. The overseers began to whisper among themselves. They had seen cruelty before, but this was something darker. They watched a mistress unravel, her elegance giving way to obsession. Some muttered that she had gone too far, that such methods would draw curses upon the plantation. Even the colonel could not ignore it now. He stood in the shadows of the instruction room one evening, watching his wife calmly force a child to kneel in silence as she recited scripture twisted into commands. He felt the sickness rise in his chest. This was not innovation. This was madness dressed in lace. Cordelia smiled as if she still held dominion, but the truth was plain. The Kane family had not broken. Instead, they had unmasked her. And in the quiet resilience of their silence, her empire trembled. The colonel left the workshop that night with a realization colder than any winter frost. Cordelia was no longer merely dangerous to the Kane family. She was dangerous to him, to his name, to the very dynasty he had built. And in that realization, the colonel began to wonder, not if Cordelia would destroy the family, but if the family would destroy Cordelia and take him down with her. Colonel Thaddius Ravencraft had lived his life by two codes: command and legacy. On the battlefield, he had commanded men. On the plantation, he commanded wealth. Legacy was the thread that bound it all together. The name Ravencraft etched into ledgers, monuments, and memory. But by the late summer of 1823, he felt that thread fraying in Cordelia's hands. He watched her from the veranda as she drifted across the grounds in her gowns of pale silk, her voice honeyed to guests, her eyes sharp as glass when she believed herself unseen. To the world, she was the image of refinement, charming, charitable, a mistress who had doubled the plantation's yields. Yet beneath the polish, the colonel now recognized what others did not: the quiet frenzy, the obsession gnawing her from within. The Kane family had become her fixation, her proving ground. She spoke less of their cotton yields, less of the season's profits, and more of her method. She compared herself to generals, philosophers, monarchs of old. History does not remember those who simply ruled, she whispered to him one night, her fingers trailing across his chest. It remembers those who reshaped the very soul of man. The colonel did not answer. But in his silence, his decision began to take root. He contacted Marcus Bellwether again, summoning the lawyer to Charleston under the guise of estate business. In a dimly lit office above the harbor, Thaddius posed questions not about profits, but about protections. How might a husband, he asked carefully, distance himself from the affairs of a wife should scandal arise? What papers might shield a dynasty if its mistress were found guilty of crimes against decency, or worse? Bellwether, a man too discreet to pry, offered him legal structures, trusts, transfers, partitions of property. But in the colonel's mind, these were not solutions. They were escape routes. For the first time, Thaddius considered what he had never dared admit. Cordelia might have to be sacrificed. If the Kane family broke free and the truth spilled beyond the pine trees, her name would be ash. And if he stood beside her, so would his. Yet, even as he schemed, the colonel hesitated. Cordelia was not merely his wife. She was his match, his mirror, his rival. She had given him power he could never have seized alone. To betray her would mean not only severing their bond, but admitting to himself that he had lost the contest for control long ago. Still, as he walked the grounds at dusk and heard the hollow echo of hammers from the workshop, the truth pressed upon him like a weight. This was no longer his house. It was hers. And if he did not act soon, neither he nor the Kane family would survive the empire she was building. Inside the workshop, time had ceased to belong to days or nights. Cordelia's fracture trials blurred everything into hunger, fatigue, and silence. But beneath that silence, the Kane family was no longer simply enduring. They were building. Joshua, the blacksmith, had long ago learned to see weakness in iron. The shackles they wore had been mended and remended, each repair thinner than the last. He counted the fractures with his fingertips, biding his time. Rebecca, though her hands throbbed with pain, studied the guards. Who drank more, who slept on their feet, who dropped keys too loosely into their pockets. Samuel and David learned the rotations of the overseers, mapping them silently into memory as if plotting stars across a sky. Even the children, too young to fight, carried their own weight. They became runners of whispers, their wide-eyed fear a disguise for the messages they carried in half-sung lullabies and muttered prayers. A melody hummed by Mary to soothe her little ones might carry far more than comfort. It was a warning, a signal to prepare. A spark wrapped in sweetness. Slowly, the fragments began to join. Joshua whispered one night to Rebecca, his voice low as the wind rattled the planks above them. A chain is no stronger than its weakest link. We are many. They are few. She pressed her forehead to his and answered, Then we wait until they believe we are nothing. That is when we strike. The plan was not yet full, but it was alive. A map in their minds. A rhythm in their silence. A rebellion folded into the marrow of each day. Cordelia mistook their stillness for surrender. She wrote in her journal, Their unity has dissolved. They are hollow shells, pliable and mine. But the Kane family knew the truth. Unity had not dissolved. It had sunk deeper, pressed into silence until the right night would call it forth. And when it came, their vengeance would not be loud at first. It would begin as it always had. A whisper, a glance, a spark in the dark. For the Kane family had decided something Cordelia could not fathom. Better to die in fire than to live forever in chains. The night fell thick, moonless, the kind of dark that pressed against the windows and made the lanterns burn dull. Inside the workshop, silence lay heavy. But within that silence, the Kane family moved. Joshua's calloused fingers traced the thin seam of his shackle for the 100th time. Tonight he was ready. He had fashioned a sliver of wire, stolen from a scrap pile weeks before, hidden beneath the straw where no overseer bothered to look. With it, he pressed into the lock, feeling for the tumblers the way a hunter feels the earth for tracks. Each scrape was a prayer. Each click was a heartbeat. Rebecca stood near the barred window, her ears tuned to the rhythm of the night watch. She knew the guard by his whistle, an old folk tune he repeated without thought. When the melody drifted farther away, she gave the faintest nod. It was time. Samuel and David had prepared their bodies, feigning exhaustion for days to avoid suspicion. Now their muscles burned with coiled readiness. The children lay feigned asleep, though their eyes glimmered open, understanding more than their parents wished them to. A snap. Soft, barely audible. Joshua's shackle loosened. His breath caught, but the guard's whistle continued unbroken, drifting in the distance. He worked faster, freeing one wrist, then another. The weight of iron fell soundless to the ground, cushioned in straw. For the first time in years, his hands were his own, but freedom for one meant nothing. He turned immediately to Rebecca, then to Samuel, working swiftly, passing the wire when his own fingers cramped. One by one, the chains surrendered. Not all could be undone tonight, but enough to move. Enough to test the edges of possibility. They did not speak. They could not. Their language was motion. Rebecca handing Joshua a bundle of herbs she had hidden. Samuel tightening the knots of rope fashioned from stripped bedding. Mary pressing her children close as if to keep their small hearts from beating too loud. And then, the sound. A cough outside. Too close. The guard had returned sooner than expected. The family froze, chains half undone, their breath vanishing into silence. The door rattled. A key scraped the lock. This was the test. Either they would be discovered and punished beyond imagining, or tonight would mark the first true wound in Cordelia's empire. Joshua clenched his fists. Freedom was no longer a dream. It was a weapon, and tonight, it might finally draw blood. The iron key slid into the door with a groan that seemed to echo through every ribcage in the room. The Kane family froze, bodies taut as bowstrings, chains half loosened, breath locked tight in their throats. The door creaked open, spilling a thin blade of lantern light across the dirt floor. A shadow stepped inside, slow, suspicious. The guard's boots crunched against the straw. He coughed again, then muttered to himself, words slurred by drink. He was restless tonight, irritated. That could mean death. Joshua crouched low, shackle dangling from his ankle, ready to strike. His hand closed around a jagged piece of broken chain he had concealed beneath his thigh. His heart pounded against his ribs like a drum of war. Rebecca, standing near the wall, shifted subtly, blocking the children with her body. Samuel's eyes met his father's. A silent question. Now! The guard swung the lantern upward, its flame flickering across the room. His eyes narrowed. Something was wrong. He noticed the loose chains, the way the straw was disturbed. He took another step in, and then silence shattered. Joshua moved like a thunderclap. The chain swung from his fist, striking the guard across the temple. Bone cracked, blood spattered, and the lantern went spinning into the straw. The flame sputtered, then flared. The guard howled, clutching his head, stumbling backward. Samuel lunged, driving his shoulder into the man's gut, forcing him to the ground. David seized the man's arm, wrenching it until the joint gave way with a sickening pop. The Cain family descended not as victims, but as executioners. Years of silence, humiliation, and grief poured into a frenzy of violence. Rebecca, trembling but unyielding, pressed her hand over the guard's mouth to silence his screams. Joshua brought the chain down again and again, until the body beneath him went limp, blood pooling in the dirt. The lantern full, ire licked higher, threatening to spread. Mary kicked it into a corner, smothering it with a heavy blanket before it could engulf the room. The children clung to her, wide-eyed, their innocence scorched forever by what they had just seen. The Cain family stood panting, bodies trembling, staring at the bloodied corpse of the guard. Silence returned, but it was no longer the silence of oppression. It was the silence after a storm, when the air itself tastes of fire and iron. For the first time, they had killed one of their captors. For the first time, they had struck back. And now, there was no turning back. The room stank of blood and smoke. The guard's body lay twisted on the ground, eyes glazed, mouth slack, a dark pool seeping into the straw beneath him. Joshua stared at the corpse, his hands dripping red, his chest heaving as if he had run miles. For a moment, he felt the rush of freedom in his veins, but with it came dread. They had crossed a threshold there was no returning from. Rebecca broke the paralysis first. Her voice was sharp, commanding. "We have no time. Move him." Samuel and David obeyed, dragging the body into the corner, covering it with a pile of rotting fabric meant for repairs. Mary bound the children's faces against her dress so they would not see more than they already had, though their muffled sobs made it clear the image would haunt them forever. Joshua took the guard's keys, his belt knife, and the pistol tucked into his waistband. For the first time, he felt iron in his hands not as chains, but as weapons. The weight of it both thrilled and terrified him. Outside, the night was restless. The crickets still sang, but somewhere in the distance a dog barked, sharp and insistent. Rebecca stiffened. They'll notice his absence. They'll come. They had minutes, perhaps less. Quickly. Samuel relit the lantern, placing it carefully near the door, as if the guard had merely set it down before stepping out. David smeared mud across the bloodstains, dulling their shine. It was sloppy, temporary, but it might buy them time. Every motion carried urgency, yet each knew the truth. No disguise could last. Discovery was inevitable. Back at the main house, Cordelia sat in her study, writing by candlelight. She had been restless herself, unsatisfied with the latest results of her bonding experiments. The cracks in her subjects disturbed her. There was resistance still, embers that refused to die. When the bark of the dog reached her ears, she lifted her head, eyes narrowing. Something was wrong. Her quill hovered over the page. She wrote only one phrase. Test group unstable. Immediate intervention required. The Cain family pressed together in the shadows of their prison, the stolen pistol now clutched in Joshua's grip. Their plan had changed. There was no more waiting, no more whispering. They had killed, and soon the entire plantation would know. Somewhere in the dark, Cordelia was already rising from her chair. The war had begun. The overseers arrived before dawn. The sound of hooves shattered the stillness. 5 riders with lanterns swinging like burning eyes, their shadows cutting long across the fields. The Kane family heard them before they saw them. The rhythm of horses pounding closer, closer, until the workshop itself seemed to shake. The door burst open. Armed men flooded in, their rifles catching the faint light. Joshua stepped forward, pistol raised, his breath harsh in his throat. For a moment, time hung suspended. A father with nothing left to lose, facing men who had always believed him powerless. His finger tightened on the trigger. Then, Cordelia stepped inside. She wore no riding cloak, no armor, nothing but a silk gown, as if she had risen from bed untouched by fear. Her calmness froze the room more than any weapon. Her eyes fell on Joshua first, then drifted across Rebecca, the children, the hidden body beneath the rags. Slowly, deliberately, she smiled. "I wondered how long it would take," she said, her voice cold honey. "The Kane blood runs strong, too strong, but strength can be broken." She gestured with the faintest flick of her hand. 2 overseers advanced, rifles trained, yet Cordelia motioned for them to hold. She wanted no sudden slaughter, not yet. This was her theater, her experiment, and rebellion was simply the next variable to manipulate. Walking closer, she crouched near the children, ignoring Joshua's trembling pistol. She touched the face of Mary's youngest, a boy whose tears streaked his cheeks. "Do you know what happens when your parents misbehave?" she asked sweetly. Her finger traced his jawline. "The innocent pay," Joshua roared, lunging forward, but rifles cocked in unison, forcing him back. Cordelia's smile widened. She had drawn blood without firing a shot. Turning her gaze on the family, she declared, "You believe you've tasted freedom, but what you've tasted is bait, and like all creatures who hunger for the trap, you will find the steel waiting." With that, she gave the order. Not to kill, but to bind them tighter, heavier, harsher. Chains on wrists, ankles, even necks. Each link forged to grind bone against bone. The dead guard's body was dragged out and hung from the rafters outside the workshop. His corpse a warning. Rebellion feeds on blood, and blood must be answered in kind. The Kane family had drawn first blood, but Cordelia would answer not with rage, but with calculation. Her cruelty was not impulsive. It was precise. And now, her experiment had entered its most dangerous phase. Cordelia did not punish them swiftly. Swift punishment relieves the mind, gives it boundaries. She punished them slowly, stretching fear like a wire until it cut into the soul. Each day began the same. The Kane family was dragged into the instruction chamber, their bodies bound in chains so heavy they bent the spine. The corpse of the guard still hung outside, blackened by the sun, swaying in the wind like a bell of wrought. They were forced to see it each morning, reminded of what they had done, reminded of what awaited them if they failed again. Cordelia spoke little during these sessions. Instead, she recorded every twitch, every silence, every flicker of defiance. When Joshua clenched his jaw to hide pain, she noted, "Pride remains intact. Pressure must intensify." When Rebecca held her children close, shielding them from the worst, Cordelia scrawled, "Maternal instinct interfering. Apply separation methods," so she divided them again. Joshua was shackled alone in the dark, his hands bound until circulation screamed. Rebecca was confined with the children, forced to watch as Mary's eldest was threatened with the whip each time she resisted. Samuel and David were worked to collapse, then beaten when they faltered, their backs raw maps of Cordelia's experiment. But cruelty alone was not her genius. It was the precision of her psychology. She whispered lies through the cracks of their world. To Joshua she hissed, "Your sons have broken. They begged me to betray you." To Rebecca she murmured, "Joshua lives still, but with another woman. He has forgotten you." To the children, she spoke in honeyed tones. Your parents cannot save you. Only I can. The overseers watched, unsettled, as Cordelia orchestrated this theater of despair with clinical detachment. To them, punishment was a whip and a scream. To her, it was a scalpel carving into the invisible flesh of the mind. Yet wit, in the family, something stirred that even Cordelia's methods could not extinguish. The lies cut, yes. The pain shattered, yes. But beneath the breaking, they began to hear one another again. Not in words, but in looks, in breaths, in the silent rhythm of endurance. Joshua whispered through the cracks in the night, barely audible. They cannot kill what we are. Rebecca pressed her lips to her children's foreheads, whispering, endure. Samuel and David locked eyes in the fields, promising silently. This is not the end. Cordelia believed she was dissolving them into dust. In truth, she was tempering steel, and steel, once sharpened, cuts deeper than flesh. It severs dynasties. The night of reckoning came with storm clouds rolling heavy across Charleston's skies, thunder splitting the silence like drums of war. Rain hammered the earth, drowning sound, masking footsteps. For the Kane family, this was the hour. There would be no tomorrow. Either they shattered the chains tonight, or their names would vanish into Cordelia's ledgers like so many before them. Joshua moved first. His wrists, scarred and raw, had long since learned the language of locks. The stolen wire, hidden for weeks in the seam of his trousers, slid into the iron clasp once more. A click, then another. His chains fell away. He rose like a shadow made flesh. Rebecca, her face hollow but her eyes blazing, held the children close until Samuel and David freed her. Together, they armed themselves with what they had, chains sharpened into blades, stolen tools, the pistol Joshua had kept hidden even after the last raid. No more waiting, no more whispers. Tonight was fire. They struck with the storm. The guard outside never had time to scream. Samuel silenced him with a jagged length of chain, Rebecca pressing her hand over his mouth until the thrashing ceased. They dragged his body into the mud, letting the rain erase the evidence. Then they moved toward the mansion. The great house loomed like a fortress of wealth and arrogance, its windows glowing with candlelight. Inside, Cordelia waited. She had anticipated rebellion. She had prepared for it. But what she had not anticipated was the unity that her cruelty had reforged. The family burst through the side door, thunder at their backs. Overseers rushed forward, but desperation makes warriors of the broken. David took a rifle, firing wild, shattering a chandelier that plunged the hall into darkness. Mary shielded her children as Rebecca drove a knife into the belly of a man twice her size. Joshua swung the pistol like a hammer, every strike fueled by decades of bondage. And then, at the heart of it all, Cordelia. She stood at the top of the staircase, calm as ever, her silk gown unstained by the chaos below. In her hand, a pistol gleamed. She raised it, eyes locked on Joshua. "You will kneel," she said, voice steady. "Even in rebellion, you kneel." The thunder roared. The shot rang. But it was not Joshua who fell. Samuel had thrown himself into the path, taking the bullet in his chest. His body hit the stairs with a sickening thud. Joshua screamed, rage eclipsing fear, and surged forward. The pistol in his hand fired, and Cordelia's body crumpled against the banister, her silk dress blooming with blood. Silence followed. Heavy, eternal. The dynasty of Ravencraft had fallen in its own house, destroyed not by outside armies or politics, but by the 7 souls it sought to enslave. The Kane family did not win freedom that night, not in the way the law would ever grant, but they carved their names into the dark marrow of history, whispered in the fields, feared in the mansions, remembered in shadows. The deal that was meant to bind a dynasty instead birthed its destruction. And though the story was buried, covered in silence and lies, its truth still lingers, because chains can bind flesh, but once broken, They can also strangle empires.